So we have this third person because of our technical difficulties. You'll see.
Brian Wines.
Yeah, he's going to be recording.
Okay, then
the
I
session.
accept.
Thank you. He won't be participating with us.
Okay.
So that screen would just be there. We'll try to see if we can minimize something to that extent. But let's just jump into it. It's now 12:20 our time. I want to thank you both for joining us. Thank everybody who came. There's more people who are here behind us to participate. And just really wanted to get into it. Just for those who are here who may not know who either of these folks are, to everyone's right is Samir Amin. What can I say? I'll just start on a personal note. His writings have influenced a great deal of my thought over the years. Particularly, I would say there's two works that I brought that were very instrumental in my thinking, and I'll show them to you, Samir, so you know. One, delinking, and the other one was your Eurocentrism, both of which I read in college in the early 90s. And it would be very fair to say that a lot of his thinking shows up in various aspects of Cooperation Jackson's program in various ways. So we'll hopefully get into that. And then the infamous character to your left is Feroz Manji. Many of you might remember or know of Palm Bazooka, which for many of us was a key source of information about social activities and social movements on the African continent. The early part of the 2000s up to now. He's one of the founders of that. He's now working with Derasia and many other causes. So that's by way of short introduction to both of them. Feroz is a world traveler, so I don't know where in the world he may be right now.
Montreal.
In Montreal, okay. And Samir is joining us from his base in Senegal. So want to just give it over to you real quick, Samir. You saw some of the outline that we have presented to you. I'm going fast now because of time. But I think the main question, just in summary for everyone here, we've been battling this question of the transition from our political program, the transition to socialism, particularly in a place like Mississippi, and what we could contribute. It being, in many respects, one of the least developed states within the United States. In our particular place in Jackson, which has been deindustrialized, is seriously impoverished, and we are working on developing a program that we call the Jackson-Kush program, which has three elements to it. Building independent political power to engage in electoral politics, building and developing the solidarity economy to provide a material base for those politics, and then most importantly, in our view, is building kind of a dual power in the form of people's assemblies to match that, and marrying those three together to work strategically is kind of the basis of our program. It's had ups and downs, but this question of the transition under the present circumstances is a key one. We have a Tea Party supermajority legislature. We've had that many years before Trump came into office. And now that Trump's in office, we're facing an even much more of an uphill battle. So that's just to give you a little bit of context, but the fundamental questions relating to this transition, and what could a program like this, and particularly what could an instrument that's trying to develop the solidarity economy under these conditions, what are some of your thoughts about programmatically what we can do from what you see, about the U.S. in particular, and on a global scale, how this all fits in? So I turn it over to you, Samir.
Okay, good evening for you. Now, I have read your papers. Unfortunately, I could not read much more than that. And I had submitted to you short papers, which were recent interviews. I can summarize my views in the following way to start, and then you may ask questions. You know, first point, we should never speak of globalization without qualifying it. Globalization means nothing because the world has been globalized from very long time. Your mere existence as Afro-Americans is the proof of it. I mean, you were brought, not with your consent, on this American continent 5 centuries ago. That was globalization already, the victim of which were the African peoples, of course. But that was globalization. So globalization is nothing very new. It has to be qualified. Now, looking at globalization of, say, modern times, that is capitalism, since 4 or 5 centuries, and more particularly of globalization during the 20th and the 21st century now. We have had a pattern of globalization of which Africa have suffered a lot. First globalization, perhaps the earliest one related to capitalism, slave trade. But the second one was colonization as of 1885, and it went on until the 60s of last century. That means for about a century. That was also a pattern of globalization, colonial globalization, which is one of the most brutal forms of globalization, since it denies to the peoples the right to have, of the possibility to have an own state, whatever it is, their own social, political organization, denied and replaced by colonial foreign administrators. But the peoples of Africa fought against it since the beginning, resisted to it, and then after World War II, they were able to, what I'm calling, reconquer their independence. Political independence was not given by the imperialists to Africa. It's the African people who compelled imperialism to retreat partly and to accept political independence. My friend Firoz knows it, should know it, and he knows it. It had started, for instance, in East Africa with the revolution of the Mau Mau in the 50s, that is before Kenya got its independence. And it was the struggle for independence by different ways, which was armed struggles in Kenya, the Mau Mau, in Cameroon, the UPC in 1955, before that even in Madagascar in 47, and then after in Algeria as 54, and then last but not least the Portuguese colonies as of 1960s. But also other forms of struggle which were not wars, but which were political immense movements achieving a kind of, let's call it, national union and struggle for independence. Nyerere is an example of that, but we can say many more on the African continent, many others also. So then, after having reconquered their independence, the African peoples were submitted to a new stage of globalization. A new stage of globalization, which was a new stage started before for other peoples than Africans after World War II. After World War II, as a result of the defeat of fascism and Nazism, and Red Army played the major role in that. Europe was not liberated by the Americans. The Americans came in Europe in 1944 when the Soviet army, Red Army, was already close to Berlin and could have gone alone until Gibraltar, that is liberating the whole of Europe. And it is to avoid that the Americans very late came into the liberation associated to the liberation of Europe. Then as a result of that, we had after World War II a pattern of globalization which continued from, let's say, 1945, the end of the war, until, let's say, 1980 or 1985, depending on countries, towards the end of the century, of last century, which I'm calling a negotiated pluricentric globalization. Now, it is the fashion today to say that this period was bipolar, as if there were only two actors in the world, US and USSR, and bipolarity associated with the Cold War. This is nonsense. In fact, they were much more than two actors, and they had created the conditions for a kind of polycentric globalization. There were at least four families of actors. One was indeed the West, the traditional, let's say, imperialist powers, United States and its external provinces, Canada and Australia, Europe, which became the European Union, and Japan. The NATO countries and Japan, as well as Australia and Canada associated to it. That was one actor. And I say one actor because the Europeans and the Japanese just accepted to follow practically unconditionally the decisions of Washington until today. But a second actor was indeed the Soviet Union and its client, we may say, allies of Eastern Europe. A third actor, because China, in spite of being a partner in the so-called socialist camp of that time, had always, from the Maoist time until now, a policy which was quite different from the one of the Soviet Union, vis-à-vis both internally and at the level of its international policy. But we had a fourth family of actors. Those actors which started in Asia by the Bandung Conference in 1955, which associated all the major countries of Asia, including China, India, Indonesia, and others, and some Arab countries, practically Egypt alone, and some Arab countries from the Middle East, the Asian Middle East, Syria, Iraq, and out of which came reinforced the struggle for the national independence of Africa, which came and which was reconquered very, very few years later. After all, 1960 is only 10 years after, is only 5 years after Bandung 55, and the non-aligned movement which was created as a result of the victory of the African peoples associated all the nations, or almost, of Asia and all the nations of Africa, plus Cuba in Latin America. Now, that was also a pattern of globalization, which was a pattern of globalization which compelled imperialism, traditional imperialism of the Western powers, to retreat partly, that is to accept discussing and to accept some or more, according to the cases, of the demands of the countries of the so-called South, the Big South. And that was a pattern of polycentric globalization. But the three systems, and I'm saying the three systems, reached their limits very fast, within 30 or 40 years after World War II, and came out of stream, and therefore were gradually eroded and finally had to retreat. One of the system which broke down the most with the most noise was of course the Soviet system, which as of 1989, 1991, not only the Soviet Union was broken into 15 republics, and most of them, the Western European one, were annexed by imperialist Europe, particularly Germany, but also was a total capitulation which took the form of rejecting socialism and accepting capitalism and saying it frankly. Now, but the limits were also reached by Maoist China, which led to post-Maoist China, which also started accepting some, not all, of the conditions of participating into the new globalization. The other pillar of the negotiated globalization which broke down was the Western one, that is social democracy, which after World War II was real social democracy, compelling local capital, monopoly capital, to a historical compromise favorable to a certain extent to the working class, the welfare state, went out of stream, and the socialists and social democrats of today in the Western European countries are no more socialists, even social democrats, I mean reformists, they are social liberals. That is, they have accepted the policies of monopoly capital. The third pillar was us, the countries of the South, which gradually, which had a limitation within a shorter period of time, maybe 20 years or 30 years, depending on countries, and have been retreating since. That the change has occurred there in our areas by different means. The ugly military reactionary dictatorships in Latin America, the neo-colonial pattern in many countries of Africa, coup d'etat against those who resisted, like in Mali, Ghana, Guinea, and other countries, Ethiopia and other countries, but also by the erosion of the national, what I'm calling the national popular attempts of the previous decades, accepting gradually the dictatorship of monopoly capital. Now, that retreat of the three conditions for a new pattern of globalization, the one we know today, which is so-called neoliberal. It is not neoliberal, it is paleoliberal, in the sense that its program is to come back to I'm saying 18, not 19, 1820 or 1830, the early capitalism, when the capitalists were totally free and the working classes had no right of any kind. Now, this paleo-liberalism, which calls itself neoliberalism, has been able, due to the breakdown of the three systems which had created the conditions for a negotiated globalization, to a new pattern of globalization, which is unilateral. Now, that leads me to a second point, which is very important. That is related to a change which occurred within the capitalist system in its centers, basically, I would say, the United States, Western and Central Europe, and Japan, which I call for that reason, the triad, which are the major, which are represented by the G7, say, or by the so-called international organization, the World Bank, IMF, and WTO, which are not international organizations, but organizations for the dictatorship of the West on the rest of the world. Now, these the breakdown of the three systems has created that pattern. We should qualify it. We should call it neo-imperialist globalization and not globalization. That is a globalization which is unilateral. They decide, and we should adjust. The word is invented, is used by the World Bank. When the World Bank speaks of adjustment, they mean the adjustment of the South to the demands of the North, and never the adjustment of the North to the demands of the South. Congo is invited to adjust to the needs of US. US are not asked to adjust to the needs of Congo. So that is the pattern. And therefore, that leads me, that has also created the conditions for a new stage of monopoly capital. Monopoly capital is nothing new. It has started at the end of the 19th century, as you know, has been analyzed by social democrats, Hobson, Hilferding, but it is Lenin, a communist, who derived from this analysis a political conclusion that the era was therefore, as of his time, the era, the possibility of having socialist revolutions. But and this is not pure chance, those socialist revolutions became on the agenda of countries of the peripheries. It started in a semi-periphery, the weak link, Russia, then moved to a periphery, China, Vietnam, Cuba, then moved also even in different ways which were watered down by the leadership of the bourgeoisie of the National Front for Liberation in Asia and Africa, from India, Indonesia, including Naserian Egypt, including FLN Algeria, to the neo-colonial countries of many regions in Africa. Now, this is the pattern of globalization that we have today. Now, the monopoly capital in a very, very short period of time, between 1970, the systemic crisis that we are living in started in 2008 or 9 or 11 or 8 or 7 or 8 with the famous breakdown, financial breakdown, but started in the middle of the 70s of last century. As of 1973-75, the rates of growth, which had been around 5-6% on the average for the countries, the major capitalist countries, United States, Europe, and Japan, went down to half of it, or less than half of it, to around 1 to 2%. So it is very funny, amusing, that when the rate of growth is moving from 1.7 to 1.8, they are shouting, "We are moving out of the crisis," forgetting that they had rates of growth of 5 or 6% before. Now, but simultaneously, during this period, a very short period between 75 and 90, that is 15 years, it's very short, and there was a tremendous centralization of the control of capital by monopoly, to the extent that almost any other form of production today is submitted to the status of my English, of being submitted to monopoly capital, and the most of the value which is created is pumped out by monopoly and becomes imperialist rent. But simultaneously to that breakdown in the West, there was, we have had countries, many countries, not some, many countries of the South reaching high rates of growth. China was given as the example, but before it you had South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, later Malaysia and Thailand, and later China, and later also or simultaneously India and other countries of Asia, of Africa and Latin America. Now, so one of the sayings which is very common today is that capitalism is not in crisis. What is happening is that the center of gravity of capitalism is moving from the old countries of the Atlantic Ocean, United States and Western Europe, to the Pacific, and particularly the Pacific, to Asia basically, Eastern and Southern Asia, China, India, Southeast Asia, and to Latin America, and marginally perhaps in a number of countries of Africa. That is what is being said. It is nonsense again, because our rate of growth in the South, whenever there is a rate of growth, is related to one of the two following factors. One, it is related to the plunder of our natural resources. The plunder of not only oil, gas, but also mineral resources, and now more and more the plunder of land, arable land, particularly in Africa, but also in Latin America, and in some areas in Asia. That is one form. The other form is the super exploitation of cheap labor for industries which are submitted to monopoly capital, directly or indirectly, which are subcontractors de facto, and in some cases even de jure, subcontractors for monopoly capital. Now, we have therefore a new system which is characterized by the relative unity. This is why I'm speaking now of the collective imperialism of the triad, United States, Europe, and Japan, collective imperialism, while in the past imperialism was to be conjugated in the plural. There was nothing called imperialism. There was British imperialism, Japanese imperialism, German imperialism, US imperialism, French imperialism, and they were in conflict among themselves, leading even to armed conflicts, and gigantic one like the First and the Second World War. But now we have no more that. We have a collective leader, a collective imperialism with a leader, which is the United States, even if today, perhaps, and thanks to the stupidity of Trump, among other factors, is meeting some problems in its relation to the other partners of this collective imperialism. And we have, on the other side, comprador or semi-comprador countries which accept either the plunder or the overexploitation of their cheap labor. Whenever we have a high rate of growth, what does it mean? If we take the caricature country of Equatorial Guinea, which has a rate of growth of 15% or 20% per year, that is the double of China since 20 years. It's exclusively oil, and it is benefiting to perhaps only one person, the president, perhaps a family and some friends around it, at least not more than 1% of the population. and the rest of the population is pauperized. Now, you have a high rate of growth in India, but this high rate of growth in India benefits to not 1% in the case of India, but to 20%, and it is pauperization for 80%. This is a general pattern in Africa also. Whenever you have a relative moderate or high growth here and there, it is no more than 20% of the people who benefit from it, while it is still pauperization for the vast majorities. The only exception possible is China, in which case the high rates of growth have benefited everybody, or 90% of the population, but benefited to them very unequally and growingly unequally. That is, with a rate of growth per capita of 1% or 2% for the lower strata, of 5% for the middle classes, and of, 25% for the new aristocracy, or the financial aristocracy of China. Now, therefore, this is the globalization that we are facing all. And this is our common enemy. This pattern of globalization, I'm saying, is not sustainable, precisely not only because we are, and our people will be more and more resisting, even if this resistance is weakened by the lack of political clear consciousness and organization, but is going to grow, but also because it has led to this continuous stagnation since 70 years now, or 50 years in the Western developed capitalist countries, and therefore is not sustainable. So what we ought to conclude from that, and this is what I'm concluding, is that we need two things. One, we need re-establishing a real political solidarity between all the states, and I'm saying states, but perhaps I should start by peoples, working people, nations, and then after, as a result of it, to various extent, even the states of the South, which we don't have now. Non-alignment is dead, and we should have a revival and an extension of non-alignment to the whole of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and it should now Russia and perhaps some of the other countries of the ex-Soviet Union, particularly in Asia. Now, that is what. But we have also a room which is being created for recreating an international that is just as was the first, the second, and third international, attempting to bring together not only the proletariat, but the working classes and peoples of the North as well as of the South, of the various South, because it's plural. But and that is what should be on the agenda. Now, how you will translate that into practical policies, I have not a blueprint in my pocket and say you should do that, because the conditions differ from one country to another, from one time to another, continuously, and therefore the way is open to inventing new forms of action and organization. But what I believe is that without, and I will use a word which is not popular, without some type of vanguards, some type of leadership, but plural, vanguards, leaderships, not a leader, a vanguard, the movement will not be able to achieve much and will be, at best, its successes will be very related, very limited, and perhaps even they will be reabsorbed by the system and defeated. We need that. Now, that pattern, that new international cannot be a replica of what had been the second international, which was practically European, no presence in Asia and Africa, or the third international, which had a presence in Asia and Africa, but which had, because of the conditions of this Russian Revolution of October, associated to the idea that the vanguard is one, not plural, and the party therefore is one party, one country, one party, the good one, the one who says exactly where we should go, and all the others are wrong, are mistaken, or even worse, are traitors. But we need to have, to accept a plurality of organizations, parties, but understanding that what we share in common, which is that we should get rid of that pattern of globalization, so-called neoliberal globalization, which I call neo-imperialist, collective imperialist globalization, that what we have in common, this enemy, is much more important than what divides us. So perhaps I should stop at that point, leaving room for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. We wanted to set some a few minutes to give you a first response on some things, Feroz. Then we'll open it up to our members and supporters here in Jackson.
Yeah, thanks. That was a very helpful introduction, Samir. What I think would be really important is for you, Kali, to help share with Samir the struggles which you are actually facing. I mean, what you've made happen in Jackson is unique. You've created almost a situation of, in a limited form, a dual power. You've organized the community, you've got people together and are creating an economy today which is a challenge to the authorities. However, it's being done, socialism in one little area, where the problem is that you're faced and being undermined by the larger political environment. And I think it would be very helpful if you were able to speak about this to Samir, so he gets a good context of what you have achieved and the struggles that you now face.
Now,
we can't see your video, Feroz, just to let you know.
I salute your struggles. I know very little of it. What I know of it is out of what you write, particularly, and what some others write. The conventional media do not reflect, except if there is some violence here and there, and they focus on that and nothing else. And I think that your struggle is glorious, and maybe you are right that you have changed balance of forces within the people, who are associated with you and are more and more, maybe, and I hope so, and probably it is correct, and probably, fortunately, it is not exclusively in Jackson and Mississippi, but also in other places in North America, in the United States, and possibly it's not only within the Black community or the Afro-Asians, but also with the workers of different colors in North America. But that I don't believe, I don't know, and I would like, and I will read it more of what you are writing, but I am not in a position to say that the type of economy that are building can be independent from the domination of capital ruling the United States. It will be turned into precisely what I said, that is submitted to it finally, and the value that you would create in this economy will be pumped out by in one way or another. You will be really changed into subcontractors, even if you don't wish to be so, for monopoly capital. I think there is no change without a political change, that is a change of political power. And in your case, at the level of the United States, unless the United States break down and split on the models perhaps of Soviet Union, and Mississippi as an independent state could move ahead more than others. But I don't see that, unfortunately, on the agenda of what is most probable. So the general rule of which I believe may be also ruling for you, that is, you need a vanguard, in your case, not at the level of Mississippi or Jackson, but at the level of the United States, in order to change the balance of force. My judgment today is relatively negative, in the sense that I don't see, and not only for the United States, but inclusively for Western Europe, which had the traditions of workers' movement stronger, in France, in Italy, in Germany, in Britain, being able to change the balance of force between them and monopoly capital. They will accept, or the majority of their leaderships, and following those leaderships, many people, particularly the so-called voters, these policies. But I see it on the agenda of countries of the South. I see it on the agenda, I should not call it a country of the South, Russia. And it is moving in that direction towards re-establishing a kind of state capitalism, which is not very democratic, but that's not the point. A state capitalism able to negotiate to global capitalism on more or less on the Chinese model, even without a one-party system of the communist heritage. Now, I see it also possible in Africa. I know, you see, the Europeans have offered to Africa a kind of so-called partnership, which is so unequal, it is neo-colonial, in fact, re-establishing or not re-establishing, maintaining the privileges of the Western European countries, the former colonial countries, particularly Britain, France, Belgium, on the continent south of the Sahara. But this is being resisted. I mean, the project of partnership has been rejected by Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. And Yash Tondon has written beautiful pages on how they have been able to resist to it until now. It has been also not accepted. It is not accepted in West Africa by the major country, Nigeria. And it is not accepted, I don't know exactly the case, in Southern Africa. Therefore, the resistance to those patterns of unequal partnership is going to grow in Africa. Now, but as I said, and I say that for you also, without a lucid political consciousness, and that lucidity is always unequal, lucid within leaderships in the plural, and there within the masses that are following them, that are mobilized by them, you cannot change the balance of force at any national level.
Well, I mean, I think, and I want to open it up in a second for more folks.
I have never been convinced by the theory of the movement that you can change the society without changing the power, which was unfortunately very popular and is still popular. Society has changed a lot in Western Europe, particularly, and in the US. It's changed a lot without making any difference at the level of the dominant political power, which remains in the hands of capital. It has changed in relations between races, fortunately, for a little better. And not necessarily always, but in some cases, it has changed in the sense of less inequality between men and women, which is positive. I'm saying less inequality because inequality is still there. It has changed in a number of things, but this has not questioned the domination of monopoly capital, and it cannot.
So, just as folks are coming in, just to give you, Samir, somewhat of a summation of our experiences. Froze was asking. The most popular thing that folks know about the experience and I would say the experiment in Jackson for the past 10 years that has been captured in any sense by the media for the most part has been the electoral victories that have happened. 3 in particular. Chokwe Lumumba winning a city council seat in 2009, then winning the mayoral seat in 2013, and then here recently his son winning the mayoral seat in 2017. The mayoral seat in 2017. But in line with what you were saying, I wouldn't say, Feroz, that we definitely have not shifted the forces, either in the on the municipal level, and definitely not on the state and the federal level. What I think we have done, to varying degrees, which I think is somewhat being challenged now, is that we build enough of a political base to pose a challenge and to start making some tactical moves. I don't think we're at the level of certain strategic advances yet, but we made some tactical moves over this time period, as you would say, Samir, to force them to retreat just a bit, particularly on the municipal level. That I think we have achieved over the course of the past decade, but that's seriously being challenged now, Feroz. As we spoke about earlier, the conditions are never static. They change, they shift, things adjust, and that's definitely happening here in Jackson. And there's an extreme degree of pressure being brought to bear, both by forces on the state level and the federal level, to do exactly what you mentioned, Samir, which is to make both the political movement and organizations like ours basic instruments of finance in some way. And they're trying to make it appealing by offering more resources here and there to do this or that project, but to basically be a subsidiary of what they're doing. So there's some talk about, for instance, Apple coming in and doing some things here in Jackson to form certain kind of partnerships in Jackson, which are being posed as being beneficial for the community in terms of adding jobs, doing a certain level of infrastructure development. But in reality, I think if we take a deeper peek at it, we know in part what Apple is aiming to get at is number one, it's starting to lose some of its competitive edge in terms of recruiting and exploiting new talent, particularly from China and India and parts of Africa. And what you're seeing now happening in parts of Silicon Valley, and I include Apple in that, is trying to come back and make a reinvestment in Black and Latino communities, in part to create a new, cheaper domestic labor force that they hope might be able to compete within a short period of time. And Jackson is in that profile. And that you have several universities here at Jackson State, you got Tougaloo, that they're going to offer up some resources to be able to try to get people to learn how to do coding and things of that nature, programming. But they're trying to get them to do it on the cheap. And part of, I would say, where this all fits into the new kind of narrative and initiative of what Trump is doing with his rhetoric around making America great again and trying to at least make claims to bring back certain industrial jobs. The piece is to bring them back under the conditions in which either it'll further automation, as we're seeing here with a Nissan plant, which is out in Canton, Samir, about 15 miles, 20 miles north of Jackson. Most of its labor force is drawn from Jackson. And after the labor, there was an effort to unionize that plant here, really for well over a decade and some change, but to actually force a vote last year. That vote, unfortunately, lost. The unionization vote lost. And in response, Nissan Renault has been intensifying the automation of the plant over the past couple of months, and they're planning on doing more because they figured the second vote they might lose. But where Jackson as a hub fits into all this, it's like one of the things that I think Cooperation Jackson has been able to do, in addition to the stuff around the electoral politics, we've been able to generate a fair amount in certain circles of media and hype around Jackson, which is making it actually a draw for certain forces of capital like Apple to bring that back, but not to come in on our terms, but to come in under new terms of exploitation, which offer at best, you can be a subsidiary. We welcome you to be a subsidiary. And it fits into a certain mode of progressive politics being pushed by a sector of the Democratic Party that we're really starting to confront here on the local level in many, many ways, as they are trying to capture both the energy and the hard work that is winning over some decades into Jackson, in part to refortify, rebuild the Democratic Party as part of their kind of national strategy and outlook. And we are really kind of at a crossroads now within our own project and experiment with all of this, of trying to find the path forward that, number one, kind of keeps our forces as united as they can be, both programmatically and politically, but to also create as much strategic flexibility for us to kind of continue to exert our program around trying to build self-determination and trying to build a broad program of worker solidarity to eventually contest for political power. We've been able to do that on a municipal level and win those elections that I spoke of. But even still, I don't think that I wouldn't say we've changed the balance of forces for Rose. I think that would be stretching, and I think we've created some elements of a model that other communities can follow, and that we hope they follow, because this gets back to the point that Samir was making, that I think many of us have been seriously conscious of from the beginning. Now, we support kind of a municipalist obviously, but not in isolation. And some people are making that argument that we should kind of fortify the municipalities, that most of the concentrated power is there, and then the municipalities, throughout the globe should link up. So Jackson link up with, say, a Barcelona or Thessaloniki, etc. Like that has its limits in our view, particularly given the nature of the structure that we have here in the United States. And we are very cognizant of the fact that if
I have heard you, and I certainly I am, even if my knowledge of facts is very limited on what has happened, I am absolutely convinced that you are on the good way, on the good road. That is that you have led struggles which have given results, including political electoral results, and that is significant. I do not doubt of that. And this is progressive, very strongly progressive, precisely because it has contributed, and it will contribute more and more, to the people becoming more lucid and convinced and understanding that no, they cannot go ahead unless they change the balance of force at the level of the United States as a union of states, and not only at the level of some towns, some places, and some even perhaps states. I am sure that the most positive conclusion of your beautiful work is that it has raised considerably the degree of lucidity of the people. And that is the ingredient which leads to revolutionary forces organizing themselves progressively and become really the major actor in change.
The folks in the audience might have.
Yeah, please.
Oh, yeah. Over here.
Okay, then there is somebody.
Yes. My name is Aaron Aldo. You seem very articulate in revolution. And for a really long time, I've been studying the history of revolution, history of Pan-African revolution, and pretty much any revolution I could get my hands on. And what I've noticed is that revolution, all it really is that the people from the bottom turn into the people at the top, and everything is exactly the same. And I'm kind of like, what is the deal with this idea of revolution? And
yeah, you see, the word revolution is a very big word with a capital R. I'm much more modest than that. I speak now more and more of revolutionary advances. That is, you change partly the balance of force, but you change it seriously, and you create the conditions. If a revolutionary advance create conditions for another one. What I'm calling the big revolutions, and they have been in the modern time 3 big revolutions: the French one, the Russian, the Chinese. A big revolution is a revolution led by people who have who are much more in advance than they have in mind a future which is well in advance with respect to the immediate demands of the people. You know, when the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Maoist Revolution claim to be that their target is communism. Communism is a higher level of human civilization. Is not just capitalism without capitalist and something a little more equal, less unequal, and more sensitive to the demands of the people. It's much more than that. It's a highest level of civilization. For sure, that was not the immediate target of the millions and people who followed the Russian and then the Chinese leadership, communist leadership. And therefore, the revolution is bound to achieve only a small part of what they had in mind, which corresponds to a large part of what the peoples immediately demanded, but then after, of course, because of that, it has to come to the term of thermidor has been used. Thermidor refers to the French Revolution, that the French Revolution was not a bourgeois revolution. It was a popular revolution, but a popular revolution led to a large extent by the bourgeoisie, but being compelled to accept the relative autonomy of the popular masses. And therefore, it came to thermidor, that is to accepting finally the rule of the minority leadership of the bourgeoisie become the majority leadership of the revolution. Same with the history of the Soviet Union and of China with respect to their target of communism. And therefore we should be revolutionaries, but have no illusions. Revolution is not going to solve all the problems in 24 hours. Revolution is a process much longer than perhaps some young people of when I was young, not now, and when you are still young, believe. The young people, and that is very normal, because they hope that, believe that change can be achieved within a few years, some 10 years. I think that the people, the elders, and particularly those belonging to old civilization like mine, the Egyptian, know that history is longer than that, and that it takes hundreds of years to change the real balance of forces in favor of the vast majorities.
I like that answer. So to make sure that I'm digesting exactly what you told me, so you're saying that just because the people got into the position of power, revolution doesn't end there, right?
Right.
So that it must continue in order for true change to happen.
Yeah, no, look, let us be realistic. What today the majority of the working people in the United States in general would like to achieve? Better jobs, better education, better health system. For those who are not racist, and I hope so, that they will be more and more real equality between the people independently of their origin. That is what they want. They don't want socialism or communism. And that this is lack of not enough lucidity, that they cannot achieve much of that. They can achieve something of that, but they cannot achieve much of that without questioning the power of dominant capital.
Thank you, sir.
Any other more questions, please?
Much questions. Perhaps we should stop at that point. Huh?
We have some more questions, but I think we'll stop in a few minutes.
This was kind of asked a minute ago, and thank you for joining us, Samir and Feroz. My name is Jassy. I think you touched on it a little bit, but my major question that's been burning in my head is, given in the U.S. context, what do you think could be the most revolutionary next step, I would say? I'm trying to remember the term that you used. That could be taken here besides grasping for political seats?
I cannot answer your question. You know, I'm not living in the United States, and I don't know what really the people expect. What is the degree of lucidity of the majority of the people in the United States? You know it much better than I would imagine. Then, therefore, we should not disclaim the immediate demands of the people, that is struggling for better wages, better health, better education, real more equality or less inequality between individuals, families, colors, men and women, and so on. This is all legitimate struggles. But throughout leading to a certain extent those struggles, you will get the people gradually more lucid about what is possible and what is not possible within the rule of capitalism.
So greater lucidity. The second question is from Brian Wiles. He asks, can you speak about the colonial domination of the currency and financial systems of West Africa and Central African former colonies of France by means of the West African franc, Central African franc, and the implications of this, of domination internationally to the Black movement in the US, relating those two?
Yeah, I don't know. These stories would lead hours of discussion, because what is happening in Africa for global imperialism, and I'm saying for global imperialism, not exclusively for the French or the British or the Belgian, but also for the United States, Africa is basically a gigantic continent, very wealthy in natural resources, which are not only mineral resources, but also arable lands. Well, for them, Africa is more important than Africans. I mean that if they could have access to those resources without being limited by the existence of African people, it would be better for them. So the major form of exploitation of Africa is the plunder of these resources.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Raise my hand. You have one, Leela?
Well, I just want to ask, what would you suggest as to how to deal with, especially the young people, this culture of violence in America? We have to go back and study history and how we became who we were as a nation. How will we go back and begin to dig out this root of violence?
Can you hear? Can you, the two of you hear?
I'm not sure that I hear you clearly, but I can guess. I mean, one of the advantage of being young is not only that you will live more years than elders, but is also that young people may develop what would be qualified wrongly as romanticism, that is a vision of the future much different from the present. And this is positive. That is, the ideal of communism is perhaps much more present among the young people than among the elders, who think that we have to be realistic and therefore limited in our demands.
One of the things that Samir, that was asked was about addressing the question of violence. Jackson is entering into.
Well, the most violent system is the ruling system. I mean, responding to the system is the most violent, and not only is the most violent today, but will be more and more violent, precisely because contemporary monopoly financialized system is not sustainable. It will become more and more fascist, and this is what we are seeing happening everywhere. In the north, but also, unfortunately, in many places in the south. That is what is on the immediate agenda is fascism. Capitalism will need more and more violence in order to keep itself alive and in circumstances which makes it unsustainable. But the response to that violence cannot be individual violence. I think it must be what we would call collective violence. I mean, when a big demonstration is facing the police, this is not violence of the big demonstration. It's usually the violence of police. But killing some people here and there, as anarchists and terrorists may think, will not change, unfortunately, the balance of forces.
Okay. I got a question in the back.
It's not a question. I kind of want to say like a response. So you're asking how could we stop violence? Did you ever stop to ask yourself where do these kids pick up these guns and how they get like a hold of all these guns and stuff to make
I don't hear you at all.
So it's a kind of a response. You may need to step up so everybody can hear you if you don't mind. And the first part of the response was she was well, I'll let her speak for herself.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
Right here, anywhere right here. So
Yeah. Come closer, perhaps.
Oh, so that's where you're at.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so my thing is, so you're asking like how could you prevent like violence, stop violence? Have you ever stopped to think and ask yourself like how did they get all these guns and why do they have so much anger building up in them? And it's just like due to the simple fact that one, some schools don't have peer counseling and some adults don't know how to approach their child to ask them, oh, how's your day going? Oh, what did you do today? Oh, how was school? Or like whatever the situation may be. And the thing is, it's just like I live in Boston and we never used to have like a high crime rate, but now it's just getting out of hand. It's ridiculous. Now we have kids being from hoods and it's ridiculous because at the end of the day, your parents raised you to go to school and become something, not to get into the streets and involve yourself into violence. And now what I'm trying to say is that if you want to stop it, you have to be the person to be there to support that child. You cannot expect to just stop without providing the help that they need.
Is Kali or Firoz able to translate this in a language which I would understand?
So
I think the important thing is that there has been a current of violent killings, shootings by both the police and of young white people, killings in schools.
Yes, I know that. This is a fact. I know that. And
so
this is why I'm saying that violence is basically the violence of the system. It's the violence of the people is a counter-violence to the violence of the system.
But it also shows a profound dehumanization that has taken place.
Of course.
And a system which is systematically seeking to exclude forever large sections of the population.
Yes. This for me is so obvious.
It's not about being unemployed, it's about being never employed. They're being thrown onto the dustbin of history.
Yes. This is the logic of that system. This is why I'm saying that the capitalist system at that stage of its development has moved into an age of senility. And we ought to get rid of it as quickly as possible, because the more it will continue to survive, the more violent it will be.
And one thing I want to note to the question that was, or the response that was asked, to make it not just specific to the U.S. context, but to the global context, the United States, including the United States government, is the largest supplier of weapons in the world, by far and away. So it's not just that.
It is not only the largest supplier of armament, it is also interfering military in many places, particularly in my region in the Middle East, Syria and Lebanon and Iraq, and Afghanistan and elsewhere, but it is ready to, it is prepared to interfere military in many places. But what I see very unfortunate is that this aggressive military attitude of the leadership of the United States is not does not appear to the majority of the American people as a crime.
Yes, that is something that I think that we have to. Why I was bringing this point up for Rose, because I think a lot of people inside the United States, maybe not in this audience, but a lot of people inside the United States are not aware of the United States crimes, both internally and externally. And so we look at these questions of violence, like what happened in the school the other day, as an isolated incident as a result, and not part of a systemic issue, a systemic culture of violence, which is not just interpersonal, but it's systemic, and it's how this system functions. That's the particular piece that I think Samir is trying to get at. So as
violence is systemic to that system, both internally and externally.
And right now, as we speak, for instance, the United States government is threatening and building up an invasion force against Venezuela, which we'll be talking about, in the next couple of days, trying to bring some Venezuelan comrades to come to either talk to us directly or to do another teleconference. But we've all heard over the news, whether we like it or not, what Trump and his administration is planning to do with Iran and what they're planning to do with North Korea. So it's not, we can't separate what happened the other day in Florida from the general culture and orientation that the government has and the system has. Because it's not just that the United States is doing these things. These are also, France is involved and Britain is involved. This is a dynamic of the system itself.
In one of my papers, one of my short papers that I sent you is precisely on that point. I mean, do the United States military intervention in Iraq has brought democracy? We can say that the previous system was not very democratic, but the system which they have brought in Iraq is much worse. And they have organized a continuous civil war. So this is a crime that we should recognize as the crime of the United States ruling class.
We got another question. Henry, let's see you there.
I'm starting to be tired,
Okay. If you can, come up here so they can hear you clearly.
Let it be the last question.
Will do.
Man. I'll definitely be the last question. Okay, well, so it's kind of like a two-parter question, but they both tie into each other. Something that you on the left said, sir, I didn't catch your name because I had come in a little bit later on. I appreciate y'all talking to us, but it was focused around the concept of dehumanization and also the framework of it and the framework of our mindsets. The first part of the question is, how do you think we would go about regaining our humanity, our full humanity, regaining our identities, our skin for who we are and claiming it from the oppressors? And then the second part of that question that ties in is similar to what my friend Eric said about how when, a revolution happens and the top switches to the bottom switches to the top, how do we make that humanity accessible to all and not just the ones in the 1%, and also keep that mind we fight for revolution?
I have no answer to your question. Is through struggle that people become more lucid, and with more lucidity, more human. Because what defines the human animal is that it might be a little more lucid than others animals. And therefore that it is through struggle that we reach the point where we change ourselves through the struggle to better. Okay.
I think I would add to that it is only the big mistake people think or make is to say that you need to think before you engage in struggle, and that's completely wrong. What you have to do is to understand that it is only by engaging in struggle that you learn how to think.
Of course.
And secondly, is
even Napoleon, who was not stupid, said it. He said, "You first go into the battle, and then you think. Not you think before, and you go into the battle after."
He learned from that one.
And he won a lot of battles with this vision.
I think the other point is that we have to get beyond thinking about reclaiming humanity, because we should be in the process of inventing what it means to be human.
Of course.
What comes out of engagement in struggle, in collective actions. And I think that's why, for me, Jackson, what you've all been doing at Corporation Jackson is so important, because by engaging people, by engaging in activities which are on a collective basis, you are in the process of helping people to reclaim and reinvent what it means to be human. So I think it is very, very important what you're doing.
Yes, I agree, and this could be a concluding remark.
We're going to let you go to bed, Samir. We see it's getting dark. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
For your contributions. Thank you for Rose. We're looking forward to more engagement over the next couple of months and weeks. So stay tuned.
Okay, take care.
I hope so. And thank you for this beautiful talk. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Samir.
And continue.
All right.
Okay, thanks.